There's a moment that catches almost everyone off guard. A moment that arrives right when you thought the story was finally over. You stopped reaching out. You stopped checking. You stopped organizing your days around whether today would be the day they finally came back. And just as your life started to feel like yours again, something happened that you never saw coming. Something that reopened a door you'd already closed and locked. If this hasn't happened to you yet, it might. And if it already has, you need to understand exactly what you're looking at. Because what feels like a coincidence, a change of heart, or even genuine remorse is often something far more calculated in its origins, even if the person doing it couldn't fully explain their own motivation if you asked them directly. Let's talk about what actually happens the moment someone avoidant senses they've genuinely lost access to you. For most of the relationship, or most of whatever came after it ended, distance functioned as a tool they controlled. They decided when to pull away, when to reappear, when to offer just enough warmth to keep the connection alive without ever fully committing to it. This entire dynamic depended on one crucial, often invisible condition: your continued availability. As long as some part of you stayed open, stayed hopeful, stayed reachable, the arrangement worked exactly as their nervous system needed it to. They got closeness on their terms, without ever having to risk the vulnerability that consistent mutual intimacy would require. But something shifts the moment that availability disappears. The moment you stop checking your phone with that particular kind of hope. The moment their name stops producing the same spike of anticipation it used to. The moment you genuinely, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, start building a life that no longer orbits around the possibility of them coming back. That shift is rarely visible from the outside. You don't need to tell them. You don't need to prove it. Somehow, almost uncannily, they often sense it anyway, through the subtle absence of whatever residual energy used to flow in their direction. This is where the pattern we need to talk about tends to emerge, and it deserves to be named honestly, without excusing it, because understanding it protects you from being pulled back in by something that isn't what it initially appears to be. When an avoidant person senses genuine, permanent loss of access, rather than temporary distance they still control, something in their system often activates that looks remarkably like renewed interest, sometimes even remarkably like love. Messages that hadn't come in months suddenly arrive. Warmth that had been absent for a long time suddenly reappears, seemingly out of nowhere. Effort shows up in ways it never did before, sometimes even including apparent vulnerability, admissions of missing you, acknowledgments of mistakes that were never previously acknowledged at all. I want to be very careful here, because this pattern exists on a spectrum, and not every instance of it represents the same thing. Sometimes this really is genuine growth arriving late, real reflection finally producing real change, motivated by authentic realization rather than pure fear of loss. But often, especially when this reappearance follows a suspiciously precise timeline, arriving right as you are finally moving forward rather than at any earlier point when reconciliation might have actually mattered more, what's actually happening is something closer to a nervous system responding to scarcity rather than genuine, examined desire for connection. Let's talk about why loss specifically activates this response so reliably, because understanding the mechanism helps you recognize it for what it is, rather than mistaking it for something deeper. Avoidant attachment isn't actually built around not wanting closeness. It's built around fearing the vulnerability that closeness requires, while still, underneath that fear, genuinely wanting connection, the same way almost every human being does. As long as you remained available, the fear could stay in charge, because there was no urgency forcing a different response. Your continued presence, however patient, however hopeful, cost them nothing. It simply sat there, waiting, requiring no action, no risk, no confrontation with the fear itself. The moment that availability disappears, the equation changes entirely. Suddenly, there's a real cost attached to continued avoidance, permanent loss. And loss, unlike ordinary emotional discomfort, often manages to override fear in ways that patience and hope never could. This is not because loss makes someone braver in any lasting sense. It's because the specific, acute pain of losing something completely activates a different part of the nervous system than the vague, manageable discomfort of simply feeling emotionally distant from someone still technically available. Acute loss demands a response. Ongoing availability does not. This explains something that probably felt deeply unfair when you first experienced it, or might feel unfair if you experience it in the future. Why someone who couldn't offer real presence for months or years, despite your patient hope, your visible pain, your repeated attempts at closeness, suddenly finds the capacity for exactly that the moment you stop asking for it. It wasn't that they lacked the capacity the whole time and suddenly developed it. It's that the specific mechanism motivating them shifted from managing your ongoing presence to responding to sudden, unbearable absence. And those two mechanisms produce very different behavior, even when they're operating within the exact same person. Now, here's where the dirty trick element of this pattern becomes important to understand clearly, because it deserves to be named without excessive cynicism, but also without naive excuse making. This reappearance often isn't really about you specifically, not in the way it might feel from your side, receiving what seems like renewed, focused attention after a long absence. It's frequently about restoring equilibrium to their own internal system, resolving the discomfort of loss rather than genuinely, sustainably choosing to build something real and consistent with you going forward. The goal, even if entirely unconscious, is often relief rather than reunion. Once that relief gets achieved, once the anxiety of losing you permanently gets soothed through renewed contact, the underlying capacity for genuine, sustained closeness frequently reveals itself to be exactly as limited as it was before you stopped caring. This is why so many people who experience this pattern describe a devastating repetition. The return feels wonderful, feels like everything they'd hoped for, only to watch the same old distance creep back in once the immediate threat of loss has been resolved. The initial warmth wasn't fake, necessarily. It was often genuinely felt in the moment, but it was motivated by resolving discomfort, rather than by a fundamental shift in capacity. And motivations rooted in discomfort resolution rarely produce the kind of sustained, consistent change that an actual relationship requires. Let's talk about how to distinguish this pattern from genuine change, because this distinction matters enormously and deserves careful, honest examination, rather than either blanket cynicism or naive hope. Genuine change tends to arrive independent of timing that suspiciously coincides with your own withdrawal. It tends to involve sustained effort that continues well beyond the initial relief of having successfully regained access to you. It tends to include actual acknowledgement of the pattern itself, a willingness to discuss openly why the previous distance happened and what's genuinely different this time, rather than simply offering renewed warmth without any real examination of what changed to make that warmth sustainable now when it wasn't before. By contrast, the pattern we're discussing here tends to arrive with suspiciously perfect timing, precisely when your own emotional investment was finally declining. It tends to fade gradually once the immediate crisis of loss has resolved, once your renewed availability restores the sense of security that originally allowed the old pattern to persist unchecked. And it tends to avoid genuine examination of what happened before, offering instead vague reassurances, generalized apologies, warmth that feels wonderful in the moment, but conspicuously avoids any concrete discussion of what would actually be different this time around. I want to address something important here, something that might feel uncomfortable, but deserves honest acknowledgement. Recognizing this pattern doesn't require assuming malicious intent on their part. Most people engaging in this behavior aren't consciously manipulating you, calculating the exact moment to reappear for maximum effect. The mechanism operates largely unconsciously, driven by genuine discomfort rather than deliberate strategy. This distinction matters because it protects you from needing to villainize someone in order to protect yourself from the pattern. You can recognize this as a largely unconscious response to loss, rather than calculated cruelty. while still choosing not to let it pull you back into a cycle you already worked so hard to step outside of. Let's talk about what actually protects you here, because recognition alone, however clarifying, doesn't automatically translate into resistance when the moment actually arrives. Renewed warmth after genuine absence feels wonderful, especially after a long period of missing someone, and that feeling can be powerful enough to override even clear intellectual understanding of the pattern at play. This is where a specific kind of discipline becomes necessary. Not coldness, not punishing them for reappearing, but a genuine commitment to watching behavior over time rather than being swept immediately back into hope based on renewed contact alone. This might look like allowing yourself to feel genuinely glad they reached out, without immediately restructuring your entire life around that renewed contact, the way you might have before. It might look like watching, over weeks rather than days, whether the renewed warmth continues consistently, or begins fading once the acute anxiety of loss has resolved. It might look like asking direct questions about what's actually different this time, and paying close attention to whether the answers involve genuine, specific reflection or simply vague reassurance designed to restore closeness without requiring real accountability. Most importantly, it requires remembering something you may have temporarily forgotten in the rush of renewed attention. Your own life, the one you built specifically during the time they were absent, still matters, still deserves protection, still represents real progress that shouldn't be abandoned instantly just because attention returned. The version of you that finally stopped waiting, finally started building something independent of their presence, that version of you is valuable, regardless of whether they eventually offer something genuinely sustainable or simply repeat the same pattern that hurt you before. Let's slow down and look more closely at the internal experience driving this pattern, because understanding it from the inside, rather than only observing it from the outside, changes how you're able to respond when it happens. Imagine for a moment what it actually feels like to build an entire sense of relational safety around the assumption that someone will always remain reachable, always be there in the background, whether or not you ever fully commit to them. That assumption becomes load-bearing over time. It becomes part of the architecture holding up someone's entire emotional world, even though they'd likely never describe it in those terms, even to themselves. When that assumption gets removed, when the person who was always quietly available suddenly isn't anymore, it doesn't just create ordinary sadness. It creates a kind of structural instability, something closer to the ground shifting beneath a building that was never designed to account for that particular kind of movement. This is why the reaction to genuine loss often feels so disproportionate to whatever surface-level relationship actually existed in the months leading up to it. Someone who seemed barely invested, who offered minimal effort, minimal contact, minimal warmth, can suddenly seem consumed by your absence in a way that appears wildly inconsistent with how little they seem to value your presence beforehand. This inconsistency makes complete sense once you understand what's actually being lost isn't just you specifically, but the entire safety structure your continued availability had quietly been providing. They're not only grieving you, they're grieving the loss of an assumption they didn't even realize they were relying on until it stopped being true. This doesn't make the grief less real. It simply means the grief is more complicated, more entangled with their own internal architecture than with anything specific about the connection itself. Let's talk about something that deserves careful, honest attention: the specific role that competition and comparison often play in intensifying this pattern. Sometimes the trigger for this sudden resurgence of interest isn't simply your general withdrawal, but specific evidence that you've moved towards someone or something new. This might be new romantic interest, but it might just as easily be new friendships, new priorities, new sources of fulfillment that clearly no longer require their presence to feel complete. Evidence of this kind tends to accelerate the pattern significantly, transforming vague awareness of your withdrawal into acute, urgent awareness that access is not just diminishing, but potentially disappearing entirely and permanently. This connects to something worth naming honestly about how avoidant psychology often relates to value and desirability. There's frequently an unconscious calibration happening, one where someone's perceived value increases specifically in relation to how difficult they become to access. This isn't a flattering dynamic to describe, and it's worth being honest about how uncomfortable it is to consider that renewed interest might be partially driven by something resembling competitive instinct, rather than purely by deep, specific feeling for you as an individual. But naming it honestly protects you from mistaking this particular flavor of renewed interest for something it might not fully be. I want to be careful here, because this doesn't mean every instance of reawakened interest following visible moving on is purely about competition or ego. Genuine feeling and this more uncomfortable competitive dynamic often coexist, tangled together in ways that are difficult to fully separate, even for the person experiencing them. But recognizing that this competitive element might be present, at least partially, helps you evaluate renewed interest with appropriately calibrated expectations, rather than assuming the entire resurgence must be purely and exclusively about deep, specific love for you finally breaking through. Let's turn now towards something practical and important: how this pattern tends to unfold specifically once renewed contact actually occurs, because the shape of what follows often reveals a great deal about which version of this dynamic you're actually experiencing. In cases where this reappearance is largely driven by fear of loss rather than genuine, sustainable change, there's often a very specific rhythm worth watching for: an initial period of intense effort and warmth, sometimes almost disorienting in its intensity compared to how things were before, followed by a gradual, sometimes barely perceptible easing back into old patterns once your renewed availability has sufficiently soothed whatever anxiety originally triggered the reappearance. This easing rarely happens all at once. It tends to happen in small increments, subtle enough that each individual instance feels forgivable, explainable, not quite significant enough on its own to justify real concern. A slightly delayed response here, a canceled plan there, a gradual return to the same conversational patterns that used to precede withdrawal before. Watching for this gradual reversion requires patience and honest self-observation, resisting the urge to explain away each small regression individually, rather than recognizing the larger pattern those small regressions are beginning to form together. This is genuinely one of the harder things to do while it's happening, because hope, once reactivated, has a powerful pull toward interpreting ambiguous behavior charitably. You'll likely find yourself wanting to give benefit of the doubt, wanting to believe that this particular small inconsistency doesn't mean what your gut is quietly suggesting it might mean. That instinct toward generosity isn't wrong in principle, but it becomes dangerous specifically in this context, where the entire pattern depends on you extending exactly that kind of generous interpretation long enough for the old dynamic to fully reestablish itself before you've had a chance to notice what's actually happening. Let's talk about something that might help counter that pull toward overly generous interpretation: keeping track, even informally, even just mentally, of the specific commitments and reassurances offered during the reconciliation period, and checking them honestly against what actually follows over the subsequent weeks and months. This isn't about becoming suspicious or adversarial. It's about maintaining the kind of clear-eyed accountability that protects you from sliding back into confusion about whether change is real or whether you're simply experiencing a temporary resolution to someone else's anxiety about loss. There's something worth saying, too, about your own role in this pattern, not in the sense of blame, but in the sense of agency and choice. You have far more power in this specific moment than you might currently recognize. The entire mechanism we've been discussing depends on your response to renewed contact, on whether that contact successfully restores the old dynamic of open, unconditional availability, or whether you maintain the boundaries and self-respect you built during the time they were absent. This isn't about punishing them by withholding warmth strategically. It's about genuinely, honestly protecting the progress you made, refusing to let renewed contact instantly erase months or years of hard-won growth simply because it feels good in the moment to be wanted again. This requires a specific kind of internal strength, one that doesn't always feel natural, especially if part of you has been quietly hoping for exactly this kind of reappearance the entire time you are working to move on. It's entirely human to feel genuine joy at renewed contact, even while simultaneously recognizing the pattern it might represent. These two responses aren't contradictory. You can feel real happiness at hearing from someone you cared about deeply, while still maintaining enough clarity to watch carefully, rather than immediately abandoning everything you built during their absence. Let's talk about what genuine self-respect actually looks like in this specific moment, because it's easy to conflate self-respect with coldness, with refusing contact entirely, with punishing someone for finally showing up the way you'd once hoped they would. Real self-respect here doesn't require rejecting renewed contact outright. It requires engaging with appropriate caution, communicating honestly about what you need moving forward, and remaining willing to walk away again, calmly and without excessive drama, if the same old pattern begins reasserting itself once the initial intensity fades. This willingness to walk away again, if necessary, is perhaps the single most important piece of protection available to you in this entire situation. It removes the desperate energy that made the original relationship dynamic so unstable, replacing it with a kind of grounded clarity that actually improves your odds of experiencing something genuinely different this time, precisely because you're no longer operating from a place of fear about losing them again. Paradoxically, the less desperately you need this reconciliation to work, the more likely it becomes that if genuine change is actually present, it will have the space to reveal itself clearly, without your own anxiety clouding your ability to see it accurately. I want to close this particular thread with something important to remember moving forward, regardless of how this specific situation ultimately unfolds. The strength you demonstrated by finally stepping back, by finally building a life independent of their presence, by finally reaching the point where your own peace mattered more than maintaining access to someone who couldn't consistently offer you what you needed. That strength doesn't disappear just because they eventually noticed and reappeared. It remains yours, available to you again whenever you need it, whether this particular reconciliation works out beautifully or reveals itself over time to be simply another iteration of the same familiar pattern you've already learned to recognize so clearly. These two things aren't in conflict. Openness without naivety looks like giving renewed effort a real, honest chance, while maintaining enough self-respect and self-awareness to notice, clearly and without excessive hope clouding your judgment, whether that effort actually sustains itself once the crisis that produced it has fully resolved. If it does sustain itself, if genuine, consistent change follows the initial reappearance, that's worth honoring, worth allowing yourself to believe in, even after everything that came before. But if the old pattern reasserts itself once again, once the fear of permanent loss has been sufficiently soothed by your renewed availability, you'll already have the clarity to recognize it immediately, rather than being blindsided by something you should have seen coming. That clarity, hard-won through everything you've already survived, is not cynicism. It's simply the wisdom that comes from finally understanding a pattern well enough to no longer be controlled by it. There's a final layer to this entire dynamic worth exploring, something that lives underneath everything discussed so far, and helps explain why this specific pattern feels so uniquely disorienting compared to more ordinary forms of heartbreak. It has to do with the collapse of a narrative you may have quietly been constructing for a long time. A narrative that framed the entire relationship as a story about your own inadequacy. Somewhere along the way, especially during the long stretch of distance and withdrawal, it becomes almost natural to conclude that the problem was you. Not enough. Too much. Somehow fundamentally unable to inspire the kind of consistent devotion you watched other people seem to receive so effortlessly. When someone reappears, seemingly desperate, seemingly consumed by missing you, that narrative gets shattered almost instantly. Suddenly, there's undeniable evidence that you were never the problem, that whatever kept them distant had nothing to do with your worth, your attractiveness, your value as a person capable of being loved fully. This shattering can feel enormously relieving, almost intoxicating in how quickly it seems to resolve months or years of quiet self doubt. And this relief itself becomes part of what makes this particular pattern so compelling, so difficult to resist, even when your rational mind understands exactly what's happening. It's worth naming this honestly, because recognizing why this pattern feels so seductive protects you from underestimating its pull. You're not simply being drawn back by renewed affection. You're being offered, seemingly instantly, resolution to a wound that may have been quietly aching for a very long time. The wound of wondering whether you were ever truly wanted at all. That offer is powerful. Powerful enough to override caution. Powerful enough to make even a clear-eyed understanding of the underlying pattern feel less urgent in the moment than the immediate relief of finally feeling chosen. But here's something crucial worth sitting with. That relief, however real and however deeply felt, doesn't actually require staying in the relationship to be valid or permanent. You can receive the evidence that you were never the problem. Let that evidence genuinely resolve the specific wound of self-doubt it addresses, and still choose not to rebuild an entire relationship around someone whose capacity for sustained closeness remains, at this point, unproven beyond a single moment of crisis-driven reappearance. The relief and the reconciliation don't have to be bundled together. You're allowed to take the relief, integrate it fully into a more accurate understanding of your own worth, and separately, deliberately, evaluate whether rebuilding trust with this specific person actually makes sense based on sustained behavior, rather than a single emotionally charged reappearance. Let's talk about something related, something that deserves real attention because it shapes how you interpret everything that follows a reappearance like this. The difference between someone missing the idea of you and someone missing the actual specific reality of who you are, including the parts that might have originally contributed to difficulty in the relationship. Genuine reconciliation requires the second kind of missing, a longing rooted in the full, complicated truth of who you actually are, not simply a longing for the comfort and safety your presence used to provide in the abstract. This distinction often reveals itself through the specificity of what someone says and does during a reappearance. Vague, generalized statements about missing you, about things not feeling right without you, about wishing things had gone differently, tend to reflect the first kind of longing, missing the idea, missing the comfort, missing the general shape of what your presence used to offer. A more specific acknowledgement, references to particular moments, particular qualities, particular ways you specifically showed up that they've come to recognize as valuable now that they're gone, tends to reflect something closer to the second, more substantial kind of longing. This isn't a perfect diagnostic, and both kinds of longing can certainly coexist within the same reappearance. But paying attention to specificity versus generality can offer real clues about which version of longing you're actually dealing with. Let's address something practical now, something worth considering if you do decide to engage with renewed contact, rather than declining it outright. There's real value in naming the pattern directly, calmly, without accusation, simply as an observation, offered in service of building something more honest than what existed before. This might sound like acknowledging openly that you noticed the timing of their return, that you're aware of how this kind of pattern often works, and that you're choosing to remain cautiously open specifically because you want to see whether what follows actually differs from what came before, rather than assuming automatically that it will. This kind of direct naming serves two important purposes. First, it removes some of the plausible deniability that allows patterns like this to continue unexamined, making it more difficult for old dynamics to simply reassert themselves without acknowledgement. Second, and just as importantly, it communicates your own growth clearly, letting them understand that you're no longer the same person who might have accepted vague reassurance without requiring anything more substantial behind it. This shift alone sometimes changes the entire trajectory of what follows, because people often rise or fail to rise to the standard being set for them, and clearly communicating a higher standard than existed before at least creates the possibility of a genuinely different outcome. I want to offer something final here about timing, about how long is reasonable to watch and wait before drawing conclusions about whether this reappearance represents genuine change or simply the same pattern wearing a different disguise. There's no universal answer, but there are some reasonable guideposts worth considering. Real change tends to remain visible, not just during moments of continued crisis or continued effort to win you back, but specifically during ordinary, low-stakes stretches of time, once the initial intensity of reconciliation has naturally settled into something more routine. If warmth and consistency persist through boredom, through minor disagreements, through the everyday texture of simply existing together, without any particular crisis demanding extra effort, that persistence carries far more weight than anything demonstrated during the emotionally heightened period immediately following reappearance. Give this enough time to actually reveal itself, typically measured in months rather than days or weeks, before drawing firm conclusions in either direction. But also remain honest with yourself throughout that observation period, resisting the temptation to extend the evaluation window indefinitely simply because you're not yet ready to accept a conclusion that feels disappointing. There's a difference between reasonable patience and prolonged avoidance of an answer you already suspect but aren't ready to fully accept. Learning to recognize which one you're actually engaged in, patience or avoidance, requires real honesty. The same kind of honesty this entire pattern has been asking you to develop from the very beginning. Whatever happens next, whether this particular reappearance eventually reveals itself as genuine transformation, or simply another chapter in a familiar, painful cycle, you now carry something you didn't have before all of this started. A clear, detailed understanding of exactly how this specific pattern operates, from its earliest quiet withdrawal all the way through to its most dramatic, most convincing final act. That understanding is yours permanently now, regardless of how this particular story ends. It will serve you not just in this relationship, but in every relationship that follows, protecting you from being caught off guard by a pattern you now understand deeply enough to recognize immediately, long before it has the chance to pull you back into confusion and false hope, the way it might have before you learned to see it clearly for exactly what it is.